This rebroadcast of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group event, Cities Matter, is brought to you by Google. Enjoy! We're almost there. Almost back to living life like before. But where will we live that life now? For some, it's a question. And the answer is still cities. Cities have been the engine behind every major economic, technological, and cultural advance in our modern world, driving jobs and growth, innovation, and competition. But why cities matter is more than a number.
Cities matter because of energy.
A momentum of ideas that drives us all forward.
Cities matter because they're about connections.
Bringing a variety of elements together to generate the next industries, new movements, and unique ways of thinking.
Cities matter because of diversity.
Being a home to many cultures and giving them a chance to shape the place they all share.
Cities matter because of spirit.
A common hope, something to believe in, and somewhere to be a part of something bigger.
Cities matter for culture.
To challenge us and inspire us. For our communities and companies, the Silicon Valley Leadership Group is committed to innovating the next generation of cities. Intelligent infrastructure. Smarter, affordable housing. Dynamic transit options. Net zero energy. And increasing equity for stronger, more resilient places to call home. Welcome to the Cities Matter Summit, presented by Google.
Hi, my name is Ahmad Thomas, CEO of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Cities Matter Summit, featuring our closing keynote from President Pro Tem of the California State Senate, Tony Atkins. We're thrilled that you could join us here today, and we're so grateful for your time and participation. But right now, let me throw it to our presenting sponsor, Google, for a very special guest.
Thanks, Ahmad. Hi, I'm Javier Gonzalez, Head of Local Government Affairs and Public Policy for Google in California. I'm incredibly honored to introduce Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Secretary Buttigieg has become a transformational leader in public service, and he has committed to raising the bar for transportation and infrastructure that meet modern expectations and catches up with other parts of the world. Like many in tech, Google is helping with this mission, bringing new technology advances like paying for transit fares right in the Google Maps app, to tracking vehicle emissions with technology that can help planners build greener cityscapes. But in order for technological advances to benefit everyone and improve all of our lives, we need a visionary leadership to usher in new transportation and infrastructure framework. Pete Buttigieg fits that profile. Secretary Buttigieg's innovative track record speaks for itself, embracing startups and tech solutions to help solve major infrastructure challenges in Beta City of South Bend. For example, South Bend introduced AI pavement assessment software to assist pothole and road surface conditions planning, improving the driving conditions for all South Bend residents and visitors. This is why we welcome you today. We're equally excited about what we've proposed for our Downtown West project, a mixed-use transit-oriented development project in downtown San Jose. Besides providing 4,000 units of housing, both affordable and market rate, Downtown West is poised to create one of the most transit-rich communities in the region, connected with multiple modes of transportation near the Diridon Station and SAP Center, supporting San Jose's bike-friendly culture with 3 miles of protected bikeways and providing $30 million in improvements to local transportation projects. And now to our special guest, Secretary Pete Buttigieg, former 2-term mayor of his hometown of South Bend, Indiana. He serves as the Secretary of Transportation in the Biden-Harris administration. Interviewing Secretary Buttigieg, San Jose Mayor Sam Liccardo.
Secretary, great to have you with us today. I think you know you have many fans here in Silicon Valley who have been cheering your tremendous success in recent years. And it is finally time for us to talk about Infrastructure Week. We waited a few years to get here, but thanks to the new administration, your leadership, we have the American Jobs Plan. And I want to talk first about some of the scuttlebutt in the media and Twitterverse, undoubtedly that you've been hearing plenty of. There's been a lot of controversy, certainly, around a very old book, The Power Broker, and the discussion of Robert Moses' impact in New York City. And you've been saying some things that have been getting some attention about how highways have been built in the past. And I think a recent quotation, there was racism physically built into some of those highways, as you told one reporter. Can you tell us a little bit about how the lessons learned from infrastructure and how we built it in the past should inform us in how we make those investments today?
Well, thanks, first of all, Mayor. Great seeing you, and thanks for guiding our discussion. Yes, this is a time to reckon with issues that are literally physically built into our transportation infrastructure. A lot of folks online, it seems, were surprised by my discussing the ways that racism was encoded into the structure of some of our roads and highways. But this should come as a surprise to no one. If you look into our history, The Power Broker is one example, a book describing the work of Robert Moses, a titanic figure in his time, who, among the many good and bad things that he did, encoded racism in the form of highways literally designed so that their overpasses were just a little too short for buses containing largely black and Puerto Rican New Yorkers to get to certain places. We need to understand that when highways were built north and south, east and west, when highways were built directly through black neighborhoods or other communities of color, tearing them up in the process, that wasn't just something that was done through carelessness. Sometimes it was something that was done very much on purpose with the knowledge that a decision to segregate an area by running a highway through it as a kind of boundary was a decision that would be much harder to reverse than other kinds of policies. Now, I'm not discussing this in order to make everybody feel guilty. I'm discussing this in order to make sure we don't repeat those same kinds of mistakes and sins. And one of the many things I'm very proud of in the American Jobs Plan that the President's putting forward is that it contains resources, dollars to do something about it. Not only do we need to make sure that our future highway choices and transportation choices are equitable, we can also reverse some of the harms of the past with dedicated funds to look at communities that were divided, often with federal dollars, and reconnect them. If a place got split up by a north-south highway that cut the city in two, let's run some east-west connections to try to stitch that back together. My point is this is a chance to contend with that history, but first we got to face it.
Secretary, a predecessor of both of ours, former mayor and Transportation Secretary Norm Mineta, often repeated the refrain that we've all heard that there's no Republican or Democratic way to build a bridge or a freeway. In fact, we're now hearing there's plenty of partisan bickering over how exactly we define infrastructure. And certainly the plan that you have been a great champion of certainly has plenty in it for roads, plenty in it for bridges and for dams, but there's also a lot of conversation about broadband. There's funding for everything from home care to other kinds of, I would say, more expansive views of infrastructure. Why is this administration taking a much more expansive view than past administrations have of what infrastructure really is?
Well, I think this administration recognizes that we're at one of those moments where America has to make some very big choices about what our future is going to look like. But I would actually argue that this is part of a great tradition, too. Every big infrastructure choice that our country made, building the transcontinental railroad, building the interstate highway system, every one of those choices, part of why it made such an impact was that it expanded our definition of infrastructure. Nobody thought trains were infrastructure until we started building them. Once upon a time, trains were one more newfangled technology. Now, of course, they're very traditional. And I would argue the same is true about broadband. I'd say it is just as important to have a connection to the internet as it is to have a connection to the interstate highway system if you want to survive and thrive in today's economy. This plan recognizes that, and I think that makes it that much stronger.
Well, we certainly saw that through the last pandemic, or through this current pandemic, I should say, as millions of children were left without any access to education because they were on the wrong side of the digital divide. So thank you for that investment. As you know, it means an awful lot to folks here in Silicon Valley as well. You have seen some criticism already from, for example, the minority leader who has criticized that there's not enough money for roads and bridges, for example. Do you suspect that there might be more funding for some of that traditional infrastructure if this is going to be able to get any kind of Republican support?
Well, obviously, as the transportation secretary, if there are folks saying we should consider even bolder investments, we definitely want to listen to that. But I don't think that that has to mean reducing or shorting some of the other things that are in there. We view infrastructure as what it takes as a foundation in order to thrive today. And yes, that means roads and bridges, but it also means the internet. It means having clean, safe drinking water. And we believe it also means making sure that you're not worrying constantly about being able to afford things like elder care. But I guess my message to some of the folks on the other side of the aisle is we can agree to disagree on what to call it, on what category to put it in. We still think it's a good policy, and we're still asking for your vote. And now, of course, is the season where, in the tradition of legislative negotiation, we're going to have that back and forth, both about what needs to be in the package and how to pay for it. But I hope we don't back away from the idea that we got to make big, bold, urgent investments, and we got to act now.
Certainly, we've seen polling suggest there's, in fact, strong bipartisan support among voters for exactly what you've articulated. Do you think that's going to translate into actually getting any votes?
I hope so. We see widespread bipartisan support among the American people, just not in Washington. And that's a concern, but better that than the other way around, because it means that all we're doing is asking elected representatives in Washington to catch up to where the people already are. I could cite any number of studies or statistics, like the American Society of Civil Engineers giving us C's and D's on those famous report cards they do about American roads and bridges. But the reality is I don't have to go out there that much to persuade Americans that we need to do a lot of work. People get it. Anybody who drives a car or certainly anybody who's been through a U.S. airport and compared it to the best airports of other countries around the world sees in a very personal and direct way what it means for America to be falling behind. And if we continue falling behind, we're going to find that strategic competitors like China and a lot of other countries will leave us behind. We've got to make sure that we're positioning America to compete and succeed throughout the 21st century. And that doesn't just happen. You actually have to do it. And that's what this bill is about.
Let's stick with roads and bridges for just a minute more. A lot depends on what exactly is driven on those roads and bridges. And the American Jobs Plan calls for investment in 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations. That is certainly welcome news to us here in Silicon Valley. San Jose has the broadest deployment of electric vehicles of any metro in the country. And so we love to see that happen. Certainly we've got a lot of companies that are very interested in that as well. How exactly do you sell that to the rest of the country outside of Silicon Valley? We know we're a pretty blue part of the country. How does everybody else get on board with this electric vehicle vision?
Well, first I want to applaud San Jose for your leadership on electric vehicles, and we're seeing communities step up. But you should have a federal government that's supporting you too. And the reality is you can benefit from an electric vehicle no matter where you live, whether it's in a coastal city or a blue state, or whether you're in a rural area, especially when you consider the fuel savings that can go with it. Now, in order to support that transition, we need to make sure we have electric charging stations around the country. And that's not something that'll just happen. I would liken it to the way that the American aviation sector really boomed after the FDR administration decided to make investments in a network of airports around the country. Same here. Look, the federal government should not be in the business of owning and operating car factories. We don't make cars, but we do make policies that help move those markets in the right direction, especially because electric vehicles are increasingly on the rise around the world. We want to make sure those EVs of the future are built in America, on American soil by American workers, preferably union workers, rather than having other competitors get ahead of us. This is an investment in getting that right, in making sure that those economies of scale kick in. And you know, what we're seeing is the cost side is moving us more and more toward EV adoption. We're getting pretty close to where, you know, apples to apples, it's going to be cheaper for a family to have an electric vehicle. But that's not enough to make that change if you're not so sure about the range. If you're used to traveling long distances, which a lot of us do as Americans, then you got to know that the charging infrastructure is there too. That's where we think there's a very important federal role.
Secretary, you just mentioned airports a minute ago, and of course, through this pandemic, we've seen the airline industry has been devastated. Plenty of speculation. It may take many years for us to get to the same levels of airport traffic. Does that affect how we invest in airports? Certainly, there's a lot of unmet needs in terms of capital replacement and maintenance, but should we be thinking differently about how we rebuild?
Well, air travel is always going to be an important part of our economy, but things are certainly shifting and changing, and the pandemic has reminded us that the next normal may not look like the last one. First, I think we should pause and recognize the effect of the American Rescue Plan. I know we're always looking to the next thing, but that legislation that Congress passed, that the President put forward, had a huge impact on helping support our aviation workers. And one of the best pieces of news I've seen since I took this job was when we heard about companies telling their workers they could tear up those furlough notices because of the rescue plan. Now, when we look forward, one of the reasons the jobs plan includes a lot of dollars for upgrading our airports is that we do have to make sure that we have the best, safest, most efficient, most user-friendly aviation transportation system in the world. Yes, we're going to see those patterns change, no question. And we can't predict everything about the future, but we can predict that Americans will need to continue to travel by air. And I just want American airports to be the envy of the world instead of the other way around.
As a former mayor, you are certainly familiar with the intersection of transportation and housing. Obviously, you're not the Secretary of Housing, but you are the Secretary of Transportation. Can you say a little bit about how you think this administration, particularly under your leadership in this department, is going to view the relationship of transportation investments and the housing we need in our communities?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that. Of course, as a mayor, you don't get to think about housing one week and then deal with transportation the next week. These things are hand in hand, and you deal with them every day. And I think we ought to have the same approach in the administration. So I think about these connections a lot. I've spoken to my counterpart, Secretary Fudge, in the Housing and Urban Development Department about this, because part of how we plan for the future is making sure people can live and move in a way that's affordable. Another thing that's helpful is to actually add up the housing and transportation cost as a share of a family's budget and see how high it goes. For far too many low-income families, it's above 40%. Fixing that, getting it back below that. We can't do that on the housing side alone or the transit side alone. We got to do both, and it's one of many reasons. I'm glad the jobs plan includes resources to double transit in this country, something that'll benefit big cities and small, especially as we pursue more transit-oriented development, so people can live in ways that work for where they need to go to school or work. And I think most of us, in terms of the way we live, are less concerned about the number of miles than we are about the number of minutes between where we are and where we need to be. That and the dollars it takes to get there. Solving that means an integrated approach like you and other mayors take every day.
And thank you for the emphasis on investment in transit. Although some may say California has a car culture, you better believe we are investing heavily. In fact, with the help of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, we have taxed ourselves 4 times in this county to pay for transit just in the last 2 decades. We've got big ambitions around expansions of major systems like BART, around high-speed rail, being able to connect the jobs of Silicon Valley with the affordable housing in the Central Valley. How do you think this plan is going to really impact our ability to be able to build out communities that improve the equity that is so essential now that we're seeing this divide get wider and wider in communities like ours?
Well, this is a matter of convenience, affordability, but also equity and justice, like you described. Americans of color are more likely to depend on public transit, and those who do are more likely to require more time in order to go about their day. It doesn't have to be that way. Matter of fact, a healthy, prosperous country is one where people of all income levels find a lot of value in their transit resources. And as you've said, a lot of communities are willing to do it, raise the revenue, take the steps to make it happen. We need to have that attitude nationally as well. And the more we take those steps, the more it goes hand in hand with the climate goals we're pursuing with electric vehicles. Look, no matter how good we get at electrifying our vehicle fleet, we also have to give people alternatives to being in a vehicle at all. You shouldn't have to drag 2 tons of metal with you everywhere you go. We need to make sure there are good options for people. Yes, good options to drive, but also good options to get around on foot or on a bike or active transportation, and definitely good options on transit, whether we're talking about light rail, low or no emission buses, or anything else that gets people to where they need to be.
Secretary Pete, you've been so generous with your time. Last question I just wanted to pose. Since we have both been mayors, we both know that people will cling to their parking spaces like it is a constitutional right. But you have been seen on a bike, I know, many times out there in Washington, D.C., as well as in South Bend. Tell us a little bit about planning for bike infrastructure, why this should be more than just an afterthought in transportation investment and transportation planning.
Yeah, I think this is really important. I love biking to work often as a mayor. I even do it here in D.C. some days. And what we're seeing is that our cities are catching up, but in kind of an uneven way when it comes to bike infrastructure. The truth is, the more people commute by bike, actually the safer it gets, because vehicles start to take that into account and everybody's just used to it. But we got to build for that. We got to plan for that. And that's something that can work in big cities and small. And importantly, it can work in communities with beautiful weather like yours. But when I traveled to Northern Europe with one of my predecessors, Secretary Anthony Fox, to learn about their bicycle infrastructure back when I was mayor, we learned a saying they had in Denmark. They say there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing. It rhymes in Danish. And they're one of the most bike commuter-friendly countries in the world. So if they can do it up there with those long, dark winter nights and their kind of weather, then we should be able to do it anywhere in the U.S. if we make the right choices. They're happening at the local level. We got to back them up with federal dollars and federal support.
Secretary Pete Buttigieg, it has been a great pleasure to be with you. It's also a wonderful man to see you just hitting it out of the park. So please continue to do great things leading our country.
Thanks so much. Great seeing you too.
Great to be with you.
Up next at the SVLG Cities Matter Summit, our panel, Infrastructure Equity for Stronger Cities. But first, we'd like to thank our platinum sponsors. Republic Urban Properties and Zoom. Thank you for your sponsorship.
Hello, I'm Craig Robinson, Head of Corporate Social Responsibility at Silicon Valley Bank. We have many missions to serve the community we call home here in California, and helping drive more affordable housing options so others can find a place to call home is a big part of it. Silicon Valley Bank's Community Development Finance team has committed over $750 million in investments and nearly $1.3 billion in loans to help build or rehabilitate over 9,418 affordable housing units. We provided a $9.3 million construction loan and $12.8 million tax credit equity investment to help develop Willow Housing in Menlo Park, a 60-unit affordable housing project for formerly homeless veterans. We've continued to do this work and are financing the Museo May Apartments on Treasure Island in San Francisco. When completed in 2022, it will house 39 formerly homeless veterans and 65 currently homeless veterans. Building infrastructure in all forms, equitably, during a time of need for so many is the challenge of our time, which is why we're excited to hear and present this amazing panel of experts on infrastructure equity for stronger cities. Speaking will be Therese McMillan, Executive Director of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. Also, California State Senator Scott Wiener, Chair of the California Senate Housing Committee, and Walter Wilson, a South Bay native, who is the former head of the Minority Business Consortium and currently serves on the NAACP California State Conference Executive Committee. Our moderator will be Teresa Alvarado, Chair of the California Water Commission.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Teresa Alvarado. I'll be your moderator this morning. I am so excited for this panel and to talk with these panelists about equity and infrastructure right now in particular, because this is a pivotal moment for our country as far as infrastructure. And it's important that we not only understand and reckon with the inequitable infrastructure investments, policies, and operations of the past, but that we get this right because infrastructure investments are big dollars. And what we build today shapes communities and will impact our lives for generations. As we heard earlier in the talk with Secretary Buttigieg and Mayor Liccardo, the American Jobs Act is looking at something on the order of $2.25 trillion over a decade, investing in a broad array of infrastructure that will touch each and every one of us. It includes $20 billion aimed at redressing historical inequities, which the White House describes as a way to advance racial equity by connecting communities historically isolated by infrastructure decisions and fund environmental justice. So let's hear from this terrific panel about how we approach this scale of opportunity with equitable recovery at the forefront. Let me start with you, Therese, and ask you to set the framework for how to think about how to build equity into an infrastructure program that is so big and potentially transformative.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and it's a pleasure to be on this great panel. One of the things I believe you heard from Secretary Buttigieg is that this is really about stimulating the economy. But the economy is made up of lots of different layers, and too often without an intentional policy and program, our most vulnerable communities can be left behind. So I've got 3 observations of how an infrastructure program could be designed and delivered to ensure that equity is really at its core. And the first starts with this notion of community-driven choice. It's incredibly important that an infrastructure investment program be flexible enough to allow bicycle and pedestrian level investments in communities, as well as the big mega projects that everyone loves to ribbon cut with, whether they're, multi-million dollar, high-speed rail projects or, major highway investments or the like. And one of the other things that's very important is to think about an infrastructure program that allows for the operations and maintenance of the infrastructure, not just the building of the infrastructure, because really to sustain its value, you need to incorporate that as well. Another really important thing is equitable access to the innovation and the delivery of what a project could be. So there's a very incredible focus in my mind on, for example, climate change and tackling that with things like pushing forward electric vehicles and the infrastructure attached to that. But very often with new innovation, that can often be shuttled to the more privileged or well-to-do elements of our community, and then others lag behind. And we need to ensure that this innovation is available at the front end for anyone who would want to use it. In addition, and I believe other speakers will pick this up, the delivery of the program can bring its own benefits. So workforce development that's attached to community members being able to be part of the delivery of the program is critical. The last thing I'll say is that we need to coordinate these infrastructure investments across sectoral silos. So we need to think about transportation investment and how that coordinates with housing investment, how that coordinates with resiliency related investment. Because if they're not all working together in a community, we're going to lose a lot of the inherent benefit that's there. And that's going to be a challenge for the federal government to set up a program whereby the departments are working together across what I've often said, the cylinders of excellence that we're so used to being attached to. So those are 3 thoughts.
I like that, cylinders of excellence. Senator Wiener, you heard Therese talk about flexibility and coordinated investment across silos. I know that here in California, Governor Newsom has released a water resilience portfolio that challenges our state government to work in a more integrated fashion to prepare for the many challenges we're already seeing due to climate change. Can you share your perspective on infrastructure investments that achieve multiple benefits for all people and our environment in California?
Great, and thank you for having me. And it's great to be here with my friend, Teresa McMillan. As a former MTC commissioner, congratulations on your work. Yeah, I think we tend to view in infrastructure context and otherwise, we view often and make decisions about these critical issues in silos separately. And, you know, housing, and I have the honor of chairing the Senate Housing Committee, housing is, excuse me, one of those areas that it intersects with like everything, like absolutely everything. When we have bad housing policy and aren't creating enough housing and aren't investing enough in housing for low-income people, we completely, excuse me, undermine economic growth. We undermine economic mobility. We undermine public transportation because if we have a lot of sprawl and spread out housing and don't focus our housing and have those densities, it's hard to have effective public transportation. When you have a lot of sprawl and spread out housing because you don't have zoning for density where the jobs and transit are, you have to build a lot more sprawling, I'm sorry, my voice is a little weird, a lot more sprawling water and power infrastructure. Which is very, very expensive to have that kind of sprawling power and water infrastructure. It creates wildfire issues and so forth. And of course, housing and transit investments need to be paired. I think a lot of times what we've seen, and Teresa certainly has seen this probably a million times, there's a push in communities that they want all of this money because they want to build a train or they want to have all this, beautiful transit infrastructure, but they don't want to build dense housing around it. My view is that we should never, ever, 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 ever be making big transit investments in areas unless first they do a major rezoning to actually allow for a ton more housing around it. Because we've seen that over and over again. BART stations that are in purely single family home communities, Caltrain stations, the smart train. And so then people have to either don't use it at the level they should, or they have to drive to it, and you have to have massive amounts of parking. So all of these issues and these infrastructure investments intersect. And that's why I love that the Biden plan, it's not big enough on the housing piece, but it's starting to try to provide financial incentives for states to stop cities from blocking housing.
Thank you. And we'll talk about Plan Bay Area in a little bit as well. But Walter, as a small business owner and advocate, how can we make sure this enormous national investment helps those who have been harmed or ignored by infrastructure historically and who've been so terribly impacted by COVID?
First off, let me say good morning, Teresa. Good to see you. Senator Wiener, Therese, great to be here with all of you. And I'd like to thank the Silicon Valley Leadership Group for making this opportunity available. Well, first of all, let's just say this, that the idea that we're going to have great jobs and union jobs is wonderful. I think that, this is an opportunity to really get America back to work. But that does not necessarily mean that the minority and women owned businesses are going to have the opportunity to participate in this process. And I think it's very important, and I would say this to the senator and others who are helping to really formulate what the final details are, is that minority women, LGBTQ, disabled vets, and others must be included in this process as a way of building our communities from the inside out. I think Teresa's right when she talks about community-driven choice of what types of investments must be made. You have to have community involvement from beginning to the end to make sure that these communities are fully represented. The investment distribution effort must be community-driven. And I'll point out that many of these small women, minority, LGBTQ, and other businesses have had a very tough time during COVID. They've had a tough time before COVID, but after COVID, many of these businesses during this process have gone away and will never come back again. But one of the big things that's happened too is that many of them have had a tough time accessing COVID funds. And so this is not anything new, because access to funding has been a major problem for minority women-owned businesses and others. And so I think that it's very important that we use this as an opportunity for those businesses that are hanging on by a thread to revitalize these businesses and these communities from within, and use this as an opportunity to get new life into their operations. This is America's opportunity to revitalize communities that are historically forgotten and left behind. From the poor of East San Jose to the Appalachian Mountains, the Biden plan does not discriminate. It is inclusive of every American in need. We must make serious investments in infrastructure broadly to recognize that minority women, small-owned businesses are from communities that have been hardest hit and from a disadvantaged position to begin with. This is key for every type of infrastructure investment, from transportation, housing, clean energy to broadband. Furthermore, these investments must be made not as a one-off, but in a way that creates ongoing, long-term, sustainable investments in communities who need it most. The Biden plan is a generational opportunity to address poverty and to begin to assist minority families and children in fulfilling the American dream. I would like to just say, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, independents, blacks, whites, let's not waste this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and let's work together to get it right.
Thank you. And of course, it's not just what infrastructure we invest in or how we invest in it, but how we use the infrastructure we have. For decades, we've been trying to reduce solo driving rates so that we can make a dent in greenhouse gas emissions. Today, the transportation sector still accounts for over 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And we know air pollution disproportionately affects low-income communities and communities of color. So Therese, in MTC's Plan Bay Area 2050, you're taking a broad and I think a bold approach to solutions to the solo driving and the greenhouse gas problems. Can you talk a little bit about why this approach is so broad and how you're building equity into your solutions?
Certainly. And for our listeners, Plan Bay Area 2050 is the region's 30-year long-range plan. And to the point that Senator Wiener was highlighting, it probably does the best job of any plan we've had to intersect transportation, housing, the environment, and the economy, and all of the intersections that need to work together. And with greenhouse gas reduction, I think I would not be speaking out of turn to say we are chasing the curve on this. There is so much ground that needs to be made up in terms of dealing with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the long-range plan really needed a plethora of strategies to anticipate meeting the state-delivered target that we had, which was really substantial in terms of reduction. We needed more transit. We need more bike and ped. We need more telecommuting. We need to price our roads. We need to really invest, again, in electric vehicle technology. But the core to all of that is asking, what are the impacts of doing all of those strategies? The positive impacts: does everyone have access to these alternatives to solo driving? Can they afford it? Is it available in their communities? What's the timing in terms of putting this new infrastructure in? And then we have to ask the question, where are the negative impacts? With road pricing, that's a great thing unless you're a low income driver who perhaps can't absorb into their income what a priced road would entail. So we're constantly going to have to ask the question from an equity lens, with all of these strategies that are needed, how are they available to everyone? And are there negative impacts that we need to think about, as Walter said, at the front end and design the strategy to deal with those and not wait till something bad happens and try to mitigate it later.
Great, thank you. Senator Wiener, do you want to talk about our land use planning?
Sure. So, I think when we talk about climate in particular, everyone in concept says, oh my God, we're in a climate emergency. We have to take bold, aggressive, immediate steps to try to move the dial in reducing carbon emissions and not exceeding the 1.5 degrees Celsius, or et cetera, et cetera. And everyone's mad that we withdrew from the Paris Accord and happy that we went back in, and that's all great. But then when it comes to the tangible steps to do that, it's constant pushback, whether it's telling the cement industry you need to clean up your act, or whether it is saying we should extract less oil and gas, and then there's immediate pushback to that, but from vested interests, we need to have more housing density near where the jobs are, near where the transit is, so that people are driving less, or driving shorter commutes, or not driving at all, and then you get the immediate pushback. So people who, they claim they believe in climate change, but then when you say, okay, you live, 3 blocks from a BART station, we want to put apartment buildings in your neighborhood, all of a sudden they become climate deniers effectively by having all sorts of excuses for why there shouldn't be more people living. They should have their own personal BART station, basically. So it's really, helping people connect the dots about the personal choices, not just the personal choices, but the policy choices that we make, the impacts that those have on climate change, impacts that they have on air quality, including in the Central Valley, not just in the Bay Area, and helping people understand that when you fight X, Y, or Z policy, you are fueling climate change and connecting our own personal decisions, not just in our own lives, but how we work in the community to those goals in terms of climate and equity. Because we are, when you look at the air quality in Central Valley, how much of that is because we have pushed so many people out of the Bay Area into the Central Valley, and you have all that commuting happening, and it's just, people need to really focus on the big picture here in terms of this emergency.
Thank you. Let's talk about how we operate our existing infrastructure. An excellent study out of LA called How Women Travel spoke to gender equity issues in transit in Southern California. More frequent service is more equitable for women who bear the brunt of the household errands and child rearing, for food service workers, custodians, and many other essential workers who rely on transit. COVID has shown us that even if transit ridership isn't high enough to make money off fares, as a society, we still need to get these workers to their jobs. So how can we do better when planning transit service that meets the needs of everyone in our community, given the continuous strain on operating revenues? Therese?
Oh boy. The story of transit and what people want to see in terms of more service, more routes, more frequency is always dealing with the struggle of getting the operating assistance to make that happen. In terms of our, national, state, and in some cases, local funding policies, it's always been easier to get money to build transit, to build that rail extension, to buy new buses, et cetera. But to actually run them is a constant battle. And one of the things, of course, we've seen, with COVID is an extraordinary stepping up of the federal government in terms of first the CARES Act and then the CRISA, the second wave COVID funding, and then of course the American Rescue Plan under the Biden-Harris administration, that brought extraordinary amounts of operating to the table. But those are one-time gifts. What we need is a sustained level of additional operating assistance in order to really deliver the types of the level of service that we need throughout the day, and to break away from the classic, we're going to concentrate on the commute and then, I don't know, sort of figure out what to do everywhere else. And in that score, there's one other thing to think about, which is the technology aspect of it. We need to think about public mobility to deal with the needs that you described. So a 40-foot bus may not be the best way to serve someone who needs to travel and doesn't have a car at 9 p.m. at night when they get off a shift at the hospital, right? So we need to start also thinking about what is the best technology we have, and maybe think about public mobility as opposed to public transportation in the traditional way we've thought, and be more creative about how to bring all of that to the public interest and the needs of those who need it most.
Thank you. Walter, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, we will need to build and operate a system that does more than just cater to white collar commuters, that's for sure. Mapping and tracking a bus service, make information available to folks waiting so that the service is respecting of their time and their needs. Furthermore, non-commute hour transportation can cater to the needs of the local communities, running chores, going to banks, doctor's appointments, and other tasks that require public transportation. Not everybody can afford Uber. And so this alternative, or it's funny to call public transportation alternative, but in communities of concern for poor and disadvantaged people, that's the only way they'll be able to travel. And again, Therese is dead on. We need to rethink and reimagine how public transportation looks and functions, and particularly from the investment standpoint. It should be an investment, and as much as possible, it has to be subsidized. It has to be subsidized by public dollars, because it truly is not a profit center, if you will. And it should be about service and service to people. Maybe we can learn from the past, and as we look to try to reimagine the future. Years ago in San Francisco, where I grew up, between bus lines, they had shorter, faster trips. They had these little vans called jitneys. And it's interesting that they no longer exist, but they served a key purpose because they were a little bit cheaper than regular bus service, and they ran between bus lines. And they also ran during off hours when there wasn't a lot of buses available, and they served the purpose for individuals, mothers, and who were running chores in local neighborhoods to get to and from the grocery store and back home, and so on and so forth. And they were small vans, and they served a great service in the community. So yeah, Teresa, she's dead on about this. So, I think we need to also, we need to speak to these communities and find out, listen to them and find out what it is that they need as we tackle these transportation challenges. I think that, as experts and individuals who are activists, we tend to think that we know what's best for these communities. And I think when we talk to them, sometimes we find out that they have needs that are different than what we may think. And then there are, what I call, these, in Silicon Valley anyway, in the Bay Area, these white and black buses. I like to call them Darth Vader buses, because they look like Darth Vader. They carry some symbol of evil, according to some people. But they travel along our public streets in Silicon Valley, supplanting public transportation. And the current laws prevent public transportation agencies from even competing in this arena, sapping millions of dollars from the public coffers. This must be addressed. Silicon Valley high-tech companies, they don't want to be in the business of running bus services. And so, transportation agencies should be allowed to do what they do. I think we need to take a look, Senator Wiener, at these laws that prevent our public transportation agencies from competing, and allow them to compete in these areas as an alternative to bring back dollars to the public coffers. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Senator?
Yeah, on that point, with the tech shuttles or the employer shuttles, it's not only tech. I think one of the reasons that they exist is because we have not done nearly enough to actually make it easy for people to regionally get around on transit. So, for example, if someone's living in San Francisco and working in Cupertino, how do you get there? You have to take like 1 to 2 buses to get the Caltrain. You take Caltrain, then I guess you take another 1 to 2 buses. Like, no one is going to do that unless like you literally have no other option in life. And so people are either going to, are going to drive if they can. And so, these employers have filled in the gap with saying we're going to have more direct and reliable bus service. You don't have to make like 3 or 4 connections every day, twice a day. Like, no one is going to do that unless you have no other option. And so I feel like because of our truly inadequate network, these employers have filled in the gaps with all the pros and cons that come with that. And I think what I will say in terms of what we need to do, first of all, in this country, we have so underinvested in buses. It's really shameful. I'm a big fan of rail and subways and high-speed rail, all that. That's really important, but not at the expense of buses. And I feel like buses get just relegated, and that's where poor people ride. Well, first of all, great. We want everyone to ride. One of the great things of Muni in San Francisco is just more a mix of people on buses, which is not often the case in other parts of even the Bay Area, let alone the rest of the country. But buses it's so cost effective. If you give them like transit priority and facilitate it, it can be fast. I know, like, I haven't been to London in a while because of this pandemic, but when I've been there, there are times when it's faster to take the bus than it is to take the tube, because they really prioritize buses, and they have congestion pricing and bus only lanes. And so it's super, super fast and efficient, and it's cheaper to build. And so we really need to bulk up buses in this country. And the final thing I'll say is with transit funding, it's great that we've gotten all this federal money. We need to stop letting transit agencies think it's a good thing and brag about their high fare box recovery, that, 70% or 80% of our revenue is from fares. We can look at BART or Caltrain or other. That is a bad thing. When a transit agency is 70, 80% fares, that is a bad thing, because that means we're not putting enough taxpayer dollars into stabilizing that agency. It means that fares are going to be too high, which they are on BART and Caltrain. And it means that they are going to have an incentive to focus on the highest volume lines, because that's where the revenue is coming from. So we've got to get more stable operating taxpayer dollars in and stop forcing them to rely so heavily on fares.
Thank you, Senator. So we only have a few more minutes as a final question. The national awakening we're having about equity can take many forms, but a core principle that I've heard from many of you this morning is about centering the voices and needs of the most vulnerable in our decision-making. And what's interesting is in the Biden infrastructure plan, there is much more proposed than traditional hard infrastructure, such as digital housing, like Opportunity Housing proposal in San Jose, nature-based solutions, environmental justice, and social infrastructure like childcare. All of that requires a culture change. We're very comfortable talking about, miles of pipes and concrete. So how can we build awareness and change policy, investments, and services to be more inclusive and change our processes to ensure inclusion and equity? Let's start with you, Senator.
I think it's about making sure everyone is at the table, because traditionally we made decisions without always the most impacted communities at the table. And when you look at, for example, an environmental movement, which traditionally for many years was dominated by large nonprofits that were led and often very dominated by white, really upper middle class, upper income people. And recently we've seen the emergence of the environmental justice community in terms of advocating for frontline communities of color. So, and that's a great thing. So it's about making sure we're empowering and listening to the most impacted communities.
Thank you. Therese?
Well, I know that we're, running short on time, so I will just reiterate the key message that I think all of us are touching on. We need to involve and have authentically, I guess, at the table those who have been the most harmed, and respect that their views of what that harm has done to their communities may not be the perspective that we have. And we need to ensure that they are importantly not only defining the problem, but also the range of solutions, and can, create them with us. And there are challenges. We often can't do even what, communities want at any point in time, but we can try to be able to make sure that their voices are at the front end of solving these otherwise intractable issues.
Thank you. Bring it home for us, Walter.
Okay, listen, guys, this is interesting. Every time there's been major investments made in communities of color, poor and disadvantaged people, those communities have been, people that live there have been displaced. These investments must be made in these communities to keep these people in place, not just today or tomorrow, but for the next 500 years. These investments must build rooted communities or corporate investments and complement the existing communities and institutions, and maintain the culture that currently exists, and to augment it so that people won't have to be displaced, so they can enjoy the investments that are being made in these communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
My name is Stephen Tu, Director of Transportation Policy. We asked some community groups why cities matter to them so that we could share it here. Why don't you take a look?
So why cities matter is because this is the place for people. Small businesses especially are how a city's heart and soul is exemplified. And the concentration and the densities that you find in the cities gives an identity and a feeling of the culture, of the values, and what that community stands for. It really is reflected in the businesses, the architecture, every piece that you find in the city. The downtown is for everybody. Why we want to continue to invest in cities, it's where our people live, it's where they do business, it's where they recreate, it's where we come together as a neighborhood and as a community. The infrastructure that supports this is obvious. How do you get there? What's your transportation networks? Where do you live? Where are you working? Most importantly, where are you playing? You have the parks, you have the streets, you have the systems that work and support everybody who wants to be here, from the service workers to the C-suites. The cities are for everyone.
Up next at Cities Matter, Spotlight Speaker Nuria Fernandez, Deputy Administrator from the Federal Transit Administration, followed by her first Q&A with Silicon Valley since going to the Biden administration. Right now, we thank our gold sponsors, Juniper Networks and Silicon Valley Bank. Thank you for your sponsorship.
Hi, my name is Jason Baker, Senior Vice President of Health, Housing, and Transportation for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. We're incredibly excited to be hosting Nuria Fernandez in her first talk with Silicon Valley since joining the Biden administration. Here to introduce her is someone we're also so proud to be partnered with, Supervisor Dave Pine. Supervisor Pine was one of the keys to Silicon Valley Leadership Group's major efforts in 2020, Measure RR, which saved and expanded Caltrain. Before Measure RR, Caltrain was the only rail agency in the region without a dedicated source of operating funds. In the middle of a pandemic-induced recession, voters supported Caltrain and Measure RR by an incredible 70%. SPLG helped lead a fundraising effort that brought in $2.7 million in about 12 weeks, enough to run a robust campaign across 3 counties. The campaign also had an amazing ground game that resulted in nearly 16,000 phone calls, 135,000 text messages, and tens of thousands of flyers dropped off at voters' doors. One of the behind-the-scenes heroes who helped get so much of that done was San Mateo County Supervisor Dave Pine, who came through for Caltrain with endless energy and dedication to get the job done. So, to introduce Administrator Fernandez, Supervisor Pine.
Thank you for the kind words, Jason. In addition to my work on the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors, I also have the privilege of serving on the Caltrain board, where I served as chair last year. I am very grateful to those colleagues throughout the region who came together to get Measure RR on the ballot and passed. We are also all very indebted to the dozens of nonprofit and community groups who care about high quality transit and mobilize volunteers to help get the measure across the goal line. I cannot thank the Silicon Valley Leadership Group enough for its support and all its time, talent, and treasure spent on helping pass Measure RR. Together, we made a big difference for Bay Area transit. Now we turn to a woman who knows a little bit about quality transit, Nuria Fernandez. Nuria Fernandez has been a transit leader all across the country, including serving as CEO of the New York State's MTA, serving in executive roles in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, and finally as CEO of the Santa Clara County VTA. With more than 35 years of experience, Nuria has made a name for herself as an inspiring leader in the transportation industry. Now she's been selected by the Biden administration to be a transit leader for the country, serving as the Deputy Administrator and Senior Official of the Federal Transit Administration. Welcome, Nuria.
Good morning, and thank you, Dave. It's so good to see you and hear you. I really appreciate the opportunity to reconnect with all of you and spend a few minutes discussing the Biden-Harris administration priorities. But first, I hope that you're all doing well. It's been challenging times, and let's take the time to process and find some peace in this moment because the opportunities are right in front of us. Let me just say that the American Jobs Plan is one of those opportunities, and our work to restore equity through transportation. I know you heard a lot about this from Secretary Buttigieg when he spoke with Mayor Liccardo earlier today. And I am very optimistic because I truly believe that the president's focus on vaccination rollout and his commitment to supporting infrastructure and particularly restoring equity in transportation decision-making are all coming together into a place that's going to help us transform transportation and transform our communities. You know, it was in early March when the president signed the American Rescue Plan into law. And it provides $43 billion to the Department of Transportation in immediate relief for American workers so that we can help communities that are struggling in the wake of the COVID-19 and send targeted assistance to our transit system so that they can keep running through their communities. And I know you've read a lot about this, but I take a lot of pride in saying that the $43 billion, $30.5 billion under that plan will be administered by the Federal Transit Administration to continue supporting public transit. The funding has made possible transit agencies to provide a lifeline to these agencies across the country and give the support that is needed so that critical services like getting frontline workers to their jobs and Americans to their vaccination appointments, transit has played such a critical role helping people get to these sites. The plan is to provide relief for transit. That is what the American Rescue Plan stands for. The American Jobs Plan is to provide funding for transit's future. So when the president announced the American Jobs Plan on March 31st, there's the trillion in transformation of our infrastructure included modernizing tens of thousands of highways, roads, and main streets across America, installing about 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations, investing billions in our airports and seaports. And let me be particularly clear and highlight that it doubles federal funding for transit. In fact, the plan provides $85 billion to modernize and expand public transportation. And it was going to help transit agencies replace thousands of buses and rail cars and repair hundreds of stations. It's also going to help expand transit and rail into new communities. So while we live in the wealthiest country in the world, and Silicon Valley is one of the wealthiest regions in the US, as a nation, we rank 13th when it comes to overall quality of our infrastructure. So like everywhere else, the Silicon Valley's infrastructure is also lagging. Not all of your transportation systems or other infrastructure is in the best state of repair. And in the Bay Area, there are large state of good repair backlogs at transit agencies. Just for example, I'll call some of the agencies in this area. BART has reported a backlog of approximately $5.5 billion over a 5-year period. So of that $5.5 billion, about $1.2 billion has been identified and secured to meet those needs. That means that there's a $4 billion gap. On the peninsula, Caltrain has identified about $600 million state of good repair backlog for priority projects, including rail bridge replacement and repair and recurrent track and signal work, as well as facilities maintenance. The transit funding in the American Jobs Plan is directly addressing these unmet needs, and while doing so, creating jobs. So remember, the president's plan is fundamentally a jobs plan that will create good paying jobs as we rebuild our country's infrastructure, including right here in Silicon Valley. And as President Biden has said, this is not the time to build back the way it was. This is the time to make things better than they were. So as we emerge from this pandemic, we should take this opportunity of this moment so that we can reimagine and rebuild a new economy. And in doing so, we can and should fix some of the things that we didn't do so well in the past. We can start focusing on making infrastructure decisions that lift up people and connect communities that have been historically underserved and overburdened so that they can reach and have access to jobs and opportunities, rather than making investments that result in physical barriers that divide communities and create transit deserts. Too often, the past investments ignore the people most in need of affordable transportation. And too often, those investments also divided communities. We have examples like Interstate 5 dividing the Boyle Heights neighborhood in LA, or Interstate 980 in Oakland, which cut off West Oakland from the downtown core. Those of you who know me know that a big part of my commitment to transit is to connect it to equity. Public transportation is the greatest equalizer. It allows everyone to get to jobs, schools, services, and social activities, regardless of whether they own a car or not. Infrastructure can also divide communities and displace communities of color. So instead, under the Biden-Harris administration, what we want to do is to build transportation systems that are going to provide access to opportunities. And with the right investment, transit can better connect people to people and people to places. Hundreds of people of color are twice as likely to take public transportation. And what we see in this American Jobs Plan is a support for bus and rail service in new communities and neighborhoods. In fact, it provides $20 billion for a new program that will reconnect neighborhoods cut off by gentrification and inequitable investments. It will ensure new projects promote access, increase opportunities, and advance environmental justice. So in short, the American Jobs Plan will give transit riders and those who want to use transit a new future by doubling federal funding on top of existing programs. And when the ridership comes back in full force, transit leaders can expand their systems so that they can meet the demand. And with additional investments in research and deployment, put the US on a path to being a leader by creating a first-class 21st century transit system. So of course, Silicon Valley has a force for innovation for decades. This is where innovation, this is the cradle. This is where innovation is born that transforms the world, and including transportation technology. And although all innovation are not scientific discoveries, they do bring efficiencies. And I just want to spend a few minutes on the Caltrain's rail modernization project, because through the application of electrifying the technology, it's going to speed up commuter rail. It's going to reduce carbon emissions, and it's going to improve services and focus on safety. This investment is innovative because it achieves and provides a living example that investment in infrastructure is more important than ever. On his first day in office, the president reaffirmed the federal government's commitment to eliminate systemic racism by signing an executive order that advances racial equity and support for underserved communities. And that comes hand in hand with our infrastructure plan. So while we're looking to deliver a once-in-a-century investment, equity has a major place in our transportation policy. So what does that mean for Silicon Valley? The plan is going to further the goal that local and regional leaders have had for years, and that is to provide fast and efficient transportation alternatives for tens of thousands of commuters in and around this region. And as transportation projects go out for bid, transit leaders and communities through the valley can extend opportunities to small minority-owned businesses for planning, design, and construction so that everyone participates in this transformation. And in reality, in most places, the transportation system forces people to rely on cars. And that's what we're trying to turn around, is to provide more opportunities, more options. So wherever transportation is limited, that also poses an equity challenge for anyone who is either too young or too old, who has low income or disability, as well as those who live in rural communities who are lacking transit or have limited access to cars. And that's why it's so important that as we think about this infrastructure plan, and that as we think about the investments, that we start thinking about those gaps and how we start to close them. So building back better means addressing all of those needs. So as we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make smart investments in our nation's infrastructure, investments that will bring us closer together, we need to create those opportunities soon so that we can also address the climate change. So before I close and take a few questions from Ahmad, who I can't wait to see, I want to express to all of you that I hope you continue to be safe and you stay well. This has been a challenging time, but one that we have continued to work in overcoming, and that has presented a number of opportunities as we look towards a better future. And that better future is going to be part and parcel in how we make decisions on applying the funding that has been made available to date for recovery of the public transit system, and funds that could come in the future for building a stronger transportation system. And we want to do that, and we want to build back better. So with that, thank you very much. And now we can have this conversation with Ahmad.
Hello, my name is Carmen, and I'm gladly here today to share why cities matter. I was born, raised, and still reside here on beautiful Muwekma Ohlone land in San Jose, California. I currently work with Local Color, a nonprofit building economic opportunities for creatives at the intersection of art and community development. Our city's character encompasses diversity, nature, art, advocacy, and innovation. Our vibrant and resilient communities lie at the heart of why our cities matter.
Nuria, good morning. It's great to see you, and thank you so much for those insightful remarks.
It's great to see you too, Ahmad. Feel like I was sitting right next to you virtually.
Well, yeah, welcome home to Silicon Valley. And I just have to say right at the top how proud I am on a personal level to see you in this leadership role in DC at this very important time as we talk about infrastructure, equity, so many important issues facing our communities. Thank you for your service, Nuria.
Thank you.
Well, let me dive in here with some follow-ups. First, maybe at a macro level, talking about FTA and what you're doing in terms of work to improve transportation systems for businesses, workers, and most importantly, our communities here in Silicon Valley. I'd love to hear about that at that macro level, and then we can further delve into some of the equity specific questions.
Yes, well, I like talking about transit, and certainly in this new role, I have the opportunity to not only focus on the funding that we do, but also the plans and the policies that are so important as they will significantly leave an imprint in transforming the way that communities connect people to opportunities and the way that people move. And providing public transit is such an integral part of the development of not only the individual, but also the benefits that that individual can then bring back into their own communities. At the national level, I get to see what is happening in rural areas and what the needs are. And I also get to see the mid-urban and the urban centers. And even in urban centers, there are transit deserts. So I am really looking forward to working with my colleagues at the U.S. Department of Transportation and my fantastic team at the Federal Transit Administration to find ways that we can provide plans and guidance, and of course through the funding, whether it's through the annual appropriations or through the additional relief funds that have been made available, for ways to start thinking about how we start closing and building a stronger network of transportation services.
Well, we heard from Secretary Buttigieg, we heard from you in your remarks. I loved what you said about lifting up communities and the fact that when we talk about equity, it's not only the right thing to do, but it's good for business, it's good for our economy. There's a bottom line here that's very relevant and accretive. And I want to double click on that a little bit, talking maybe specifically about equity and how you view this opportunity, what you're doing to address equity via transportation infrastructure. Maybe if you could just speak to that in a little more detail.
Of course. Well, I'm sure all of you agree that the recent federal investment in transportation and the plans for that are being discussed for investment in infrastructure is long overdue. So of course that investment is more than just about buying more buses or trains, but it's also by increasing support for riding the system. And by doing so, we're supporting people. And that means that we need to start identifying and closing gaps in transit deserts and helping everyone access jobs, schools, and services. Because by doing so, then we rebuild communities and we increase that economic growth and prosperity in those communities. There's some really great examples of federal investment helping drive projects right here in Northern California. Some of you, of course, in the San Francisco Bay Area are familiar with the Van Ness Bus Rapid Transit project in downtown. And the BRT line, which will run from Van Ness Station and Mission Street to Union Street near Fisherman's Wharf through 6 neighborhoods, passing City Hall. These are the kinds of examples how federal funding and local decision-making can support and advance equity. Because by making those connections available, we can move people from one part of the city to another. This also, exclusive lanes, which is what BRT is, down the median, what it does, it can provide a fast and efficient service along with traditional bus routes in areas that are overcrowded, but are used by transit-dependent, low-income, minority, elderly, and the student populations. So it's really to help essential workers get the job faster, because it's what they do, right? We look to see how fast it is to drive our own vehicle if we have one versus using public transportation. And then those who don't have a choice are then subject to a longer commute. And we need to reverse that. We need to change that. We need to make that trip to be as convenient and as efficient and as fast and safe as if you were doing it yourself. At USDOT, we have supported the project that SFMTA is moving forward with 115 million, including 40 million out of the FTA capital investment grant. And as we all know, public transportation, and I say this time and time again, it is the greatest equalizer. It allows everyone to get where they need to go, regardless of whether you own a car, cannot drive, and it is especially critical in rural communities. Transit does something that's amazing. It provides access, and it lifts people up. And under the best of circumstances, lifts up entire communities. So our public transit partners play a big role in providing services, and whether it's in urban, suburban, or rural areas. And in the rural areas in particular, they have an important role in helping during the pandemic. So as we think about rural residents, and that includes farm workers, they also need access to critical services, especially during this pandemic. I just want to point out that down south from you in Monterey Salinas, they were able to transform 2 retired buses into mobile test sites, and they drove them into the Salinas Valley so that they could help farm workers get tested. So the agency at Monterey has also enabled Wi-Fi access to students. So this is how public transportation is not only part of the community, but becomes an intricate part of the community. And I like to share both sides of things, where you have the urban center that's thriving, and then you have the rural area that is so dependent on the people who have to continue that work in farming so that we can get those wonderful produce to all of our tables. I'm just going to go to another state and just tell you that in Montana, the city of Missoula set up all of their vaccination sites to be within a block of the Mountain Line Transit bus stop.
Wow.
And by doing this, and many transit agencies across the country have done this much, they have indicated on their transit maps where these vaccination sites are so that the healthcare providers can share that information with patients, and those who have apps will know exactly what bus routes would get them to these sites. And even better, many of them have offered rides for free. So as we see this type of movement across the country, and right here with great pride in the Bay Area, I can say that we're doing all the right things so we can touch all the right segments of our community and provide that support. That's what public transportation does.
It's incredible. It's incredible work. I appreciate the detailed answer. And I have to ask you, just as a follow-up, Nuria, does this feel different, this conversation? I hope the program we've put on, the questions you heard with Mayor Liccardo and the Secretary, many of our panelists, the focus that we're having around equity in the business community and what we can all do to be part of this solution. Does this moment feel different to you? And perhaps, that there's a real authentic point for change?
Absolutely. I think we have had these conversations. It feels like we've had these conversations at the kitchen table, and now we're having them outside the front door. That's how it feels to me, that we have taken the step to be much more vocal about equity and to recognize that we have not always gotten it right in the past, but that we have an opportunity to fix that. And that's why the emphasis on equity and that overlay on the infrastructure plan and the solutions that that plan is going to bring. It's not just buying more and doing more. It's doing more and buying more, but doing it differently and better so that everyone can benefit from it. It's everything from environmental justice, and how it has been applied to the transportation plans, designs, decisions. Those kinds of things are all on the table. You know, at FTA, we're reviewing areas like our Title VI guidance for transit providers so that we can ensure that we're delivering clear information focused on services that meet the needs of underserved communities. Right. The Title VI of the Civil Rights Act protects people from discrimination in federally supported programs, including our transit programs. And we have our staffs in the Office of Civil Rights who monitor our grantees' Title VI programs, ensuring that the large transit agencies conduct analysis on their rider patterns and that future needs are considered before making any major service changes. In addition to that, the American Jobs Plan speaks directly to equity. You know, there's a $20 billion initiative that's going to reconnect neighborhoods that are cut off by inequitable transportation investments. And that's going to ensure that new projects increase opportunity, that it advances racial equity and environmental justice, and that it promotes affordable access. Right. The plan also highlights the need to extend opportunities to small businesses, such as planning and design and construction of new transportation projects that are underway. So there's going to be a lot of exciting things that could happen as the dialogue continues around this plan.
It's very exciting. Let me throw in one last question for you. We've talked a lot about government and how government can be part of this solution with strategic investment. You know, my background in investment banking, infrastructure, finance. What about private capital? When we talk about ESG, environmental, social governance, that investment movement, where do you see private capital, ESG investors playing a role in driving the future of infrastructure in this country and here in Silicon Valley?
Yes, I do believe that there's a role for the private sector at multiple levels. One, a lot of the innovation that we are going to be seeing is innovation that's going to start with the private sector. And what the role of government, and particularly at the at the Department of Transportation, is going to bring those great minds to the table so that we can learn what is being considered, and we can determine which programs we currently have that can be used for innovation or as toolbox for opportunities so that a lot of the innovation can be made part of not only existing programs, but pilot programs that we have traditionally supported. I feel that there's just there's so many great things that are happening. And we've had at the Federal Transit Administration made some significant investments through new apps for route planning and mobile fare payment through our capital investment grants or through our pilot programs. We have something called the FTA's Accelerating Innovative Mobility, or the AIM program, which promotes forward-thinking approaches to improve financing and system design and service. And last year, we supported 25 projects to receive a share of about $14 million in funding through the AIM initiative. So in addition to the Integrated Mobility Innovation, the IMI, which also supports efficiency and promotes safety, FTA is at the table and ready to work with the innovators and ready to have the conversations with those who are looking to invest and help innovate public transit to make it better, more accessible, and bring it into the 21st century.
Well, thank you so much, Nuria. We're here at the table right with you. As you know, so many innovators, technology executives here in the audience who want to be supportive, along with so many elected leaders and friends of yours here listening to this wonderful conversation today. Thank you again, Nuria. We're here to support and be a resource wherever we can. Very much appreciate your service in DC.
Thank you so much, Ahmad. It's so great to see you, and what a great honor to be here. And I can't see everyone, but I know who all is on, and just to wish you all the very best. We need your help, and your ideas are always welcome, and my door is always open.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Angelica Cortez, Vice President of Racial Justice and Equity for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. I'm excited today to introduce Google's Senior Director of Real Estate Development, Alexa Arena. She's formerly the Executive Vice President and Executive General Manager of West Coast Development at Landlease and Senior Vice President for Forest City. At both, she's led a number of successful projects, including Presidio Landmark, 5M Project, Pier 70, and many others. But today, she's the woman charged with running Google's proposed Downtown West project in San Jose. To call it a huge undertaking would be an understatement, but as part of it, and in the development agreement released last week, Google has unveiled a project with some, forgive the pun, groundbreaking social infrastructure programs. We wanted to talk to her about that aspect of the process and how Google came to that place with these innovative placemaking activities. So SVLG presents Developing a New Way Forward with Senior Director of Housing and Community Development, Vince Rocha. Take a listen.
Hi, Alexa. As we just heard, you have a tremendous background in development in partnership with the community, driving change from the ground up. But before we get started, I want to say a big thanks to Google as one of the companies that supported Measure RR last year, which gave Caltrain its first independent, reliable source of funding, allowing it to provide more frequent service that is more equitable with reduced fares for many essential workers. Thank you for making time today.
Absolutely. Glad to be here and always glad to support transit.
We're thrilled to see years of work come to fruition with the announcement of the development agreement between the City of San Jose and Google for the project known as Downtown West. For those of you who have not seen the news, which is in every major Bay Area news outlet, Google's investing in San Jose at Diridon Station, building 7.3 million square feet of office space, creating thousands of high-quality jobs. And I understand that Google is committed to operating 100% carbon-free by 2030. And one of the most interesting parts to me is we're creating a transit-oriented green development here in the heart of Silicon Valley with 15 acres of open spaces. But I think what might be even more impressive than the result of that is how we got there in the development process in the community. Google's been far more engaged than developers who've been doing this for years. What was it like to collaborate with community on this effort, and how did that shape what's in the development agreement now?
I mean, it was pretty phenomenal. It's great to be part of an organization that doesn't think like a developer. I mean, it makes a lot of sense that Google approached this project the way it did, because it is a learning organization. It's all about understanding people and figuring out ways to utilize the tools we have, the knowledge we have in order to accelerate that thinking. And that's exactly what this process was all about. So as somebody who comes from a development background, you can really feel that difference. It's sort of going from that process of really listening to hearing to then co-creating. And we really saw that in action here. So from our perspective as a team, we learned so much. And we had the trust and the collaboration of so many leaders in the community, especially within the equity community, that really rolled up their sleeves with us and made it happen with us. And it allowed us to get what I think is a really different type of community benefits plan that's sort of less about a moment in time and more about creating this foundation for where we can go from here. So it's really exciting.
Well, yeah, that's really great. And can you expand a little bit about like what you've learned specifically that the community taught you in this process?
Yeah, we often talk about, areas that need funding within housing, within job opportunities. We knew those two areas were pretty critical. And so we knew it was important physically. So originally the DSAP, which is the area-wide plan we're in, was primarily office. It was sort of the classic central financial district. And, we kind of moved that over to a social district to trying to figure out how can we create a place that's responsive to those regional needs for housing, that thinks about this as a city center that becomes the place to connect and be. And then on the public benefits side, we really learned so much about how funding streams work for communities and for organizations who are serving communities around education, job opportunities, and housing, and saw that there was a lot of separation between those funding streams. And there was communication gaps between even Google jobs and the types of jobs and the types of readiness programs that need to, and education programs to meet those jobs. And so we noticed that it was sort of a combination of the system itself was missing the interlinks between all of those people in order to have a cohesive system, because the person experiencing the impact receives that impact or experiences that impact holistically, but our solutions are fragmented. And so in learning that from the community, from various voices, from various organizations, the fund structure that we've created, that's the central part of our community benefits, seeks to bring all that together, and most importantly, to put the central decision makers of those who are experiencing the impact and those who are doing the work within the community, so that the infrastructure and the ecosystem around it, whether that be funding or transparency into those jobs programs, are all in service of that individual need and understanding it in a deeper level going forward. And so I think that fund structure of what you're seeing by a community and an impacts-driven board and CAC that effectively votes on where the funding goes over time in a sustainable way through both stabilization and housing and job opportunities, with Google coming in as an ex officio member, and same with the city, is this gesture to trying to figure out a different type of ecosystem approach in order to create the fundamentals that work in the future.
So let's talk about that. You're breaking down barriers to build more complete community. And a big piece of that's housing. We live in a part of California where even creating 100 new affordable homes can be big news. In this case, you're creating 4,000 homes, 1,000 of them affordable. That's 25%. But I think what makes this even more unusual is Google's proposed $200 million community benefits plan. I mean, you alluded a little bit to that. Can you talk more about how it came about and how you're looking for the implementation of it? I think you alluded to a community advisory council and some of that.
Yeah, I mean, the MOU, which was our memorandum of understanding with the city, with the community, early in the early days of the project, really set out the principles of not just thinking about one component of the project, but how to think about areas of the project where we called it sort of better together, where we as Google can benefit just as much as the community can benefit, and where we are really smart about replicable models such as district systems and the ability to implement microgrids, where they're a benefit to us, they're a benefit to the environment. And that allowed us to really think about several different segments of how this project could be responsive. The first being climate action, climate change, thinking about how nature could even drive into our cities and into the densest part of our cities in a really meaningful way. All of those pieces, I think, are going to be increasingly important as we go forward. The second, as you mentioned, is how do you design inclusive communities? And a lot of that was around the creative use of the land, of how we think about the implementation of the fees that we do already own and how to realize that very, very locally. We always said we wouldn't take any subsidy for the project. So the infrastructure is borne by the project, as it appropriately should be. And so that allows us to give lots of positive local impact. That allowed for the space on the community benefits, the piece where we take how much increased zoning we have and say how much does that leave us to share in the community benefits, to really realize some ambitious goals around equity and racial equity and how we think about the growth of our communities and the city as a whole. And when I say we there, I don't by any means mean Google. I mean all the groups who have been both experiencing and working within that impact. And so that allowed us to do the co-creation process, which we talked about, which was to really bring everyone to the table and say, how do we do that? That's a complex problem that has been in the making for many, many centuries. And so how do we approach that in a way that's going to be sustainable, that's going to consistently learn and iterate from itself? And the fund structure felt like the real way to do that, and to see it grow, to see it be something that wasn't a Google fund, but was actually a fund about reimagining the future of San Jose. And that was owned and led by San Joseans, and that could be built upon, and maybe other funders come in and starts to become something that's replicable and highly responsive.
a lot of this isn't in traditional development playbook, a lot of improvisation. And it seems as a stakeholder in this community, you'd want to pass some of this along. So what are the lessons you've learned and how do you think they can model future development?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first lesson, which we've talked a lot about today, is just process, how important process is to set a foundation. And thinking in the long term, which is inevitable when you're kind of in that more owner user position, but you find all these and discover all these opportunities when you have that long-term lens, which actually is really relevant in any development around, how might a user benefit from microgrids? And therefore, how could you build a sustainable model that, works financially and works to help further climate change goals? And so finding those win-wins through thinking through in the long term is really important. I think also thinking about place, not as your as a profit center, obviously, but increasingly as a place for social connection, social cohesion, which is very much means it has to be of its context, as we've talked about. We all don't really like as much going to, a generic mall, say, as we do liking going to a place where you're like, wow, this place has a ton of character. That doesn't happen unless you're really context driven and you invite people in and you co-create and you bring that program to the site. And so that'll just create enormous value in ways that aren't necessarily physical. And I mean, I'll end on the process one again, because I can't say it enough that if we can move from that state of, we started off with community meetings, great to listen. We started to hear by doing user research, great to kind of hear. But now we're really in a stage of, and I think this is so important societally as we think of economic recovery, how do we co-create? How do we figure out ways together? And I think that is, has such opportunity that we just scratched the surface on this project to really rebuild in a different type of way in cities.
And I think maybe one thing that is preface to your process is intentionality, right? And so really, collaboration and intention along with that process results in a broad benefit. And so I think that's really great. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. This would normally be done on a stage somewhere with a lapel mic that sometimes doesn't work. And now it's virtual and at a time of remote work. And you're building in downtown San Jose, the heart of a city, and not just a standard office park, but a next generation development, a transit-oriented development near Caltrain, light rail, buses, and in the future, BART and high-speed rail. So that really begs the question of our event. When so many are going remote, why does Google believe, in fact, that cities do matter in bringing people together?
I mean, there's so many reasons why this city and this site and cities matter. First and foremost, I don't think we're ever, and Google will say, we're never in a world where we're only remote working. We're in a world where it's a hybrid world, and we don't know exactly what that looks like today, but what we absolutely know is there are moments that it's essential to gather. And as you use the word of intentionality, our intention in those moments of gathering is very much around things like collaboration, refueling, making sure we're not, too heads down and we've sort of slipped into that moment of social isolation, but opening up to being able to connect on a broader level. And that helps our minds stay fresh. It helps our teams connect with one another. And it helps people just have that right balance in life overall, which makes them better at performance. And so, of course, we always still need our cities. And of course, a city like San Jose that's incredibly diverse and culturally rich is the exact type of place that we're going to want to be. And its proximity of the foundations and fundamentals of being around transit, of being part of a mixed use environment with nature around you, all of these things are going to be only more attractive as we look into the next generation of where we're going together.
Well, thank you, Alexa. I really couldn't have said it better myself. We're just really excited to see what comes next. And I look forward to speaking with you again about Downtown West.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for your time.
Coming up at the Cities Matter Summit, a look at Facebook's affordable housing efforts and our closing keynote with Senate President Pro Tem Tony Atkins. But before that, we thank our silver sponsor. striker. Thank you. But right now it's time for Crosstalk with developer Michael Van Every and supervisor Cindy Chavez.
Hi there, I'm Ceci Conley, Senior Associate of Transportation and Housing, and we're going to try something a little different with this next segment. 2 guests, no moderator, no waiting. It's called Crosstalk, Post-COVID Development. There's so much to talk about for developing what's next in a new post-pandemic world. We thought we'd let 2 people who know deeply about it ask each other about what matters. Guest 2, Michael Van Avery, President and Managing Partner of Republic Urban Properties. In his 25 years of working experience in real estate in the Greater Bay Area, he's developed with those policies, from urban mixed-use projects to innovative public-private partnerships to transit-oriented development with multiple transit authorities across California. And bonus, they both know each other almost as well as they know the issues. So, Michael, Cindy, you can take it from here. Enjoy.
Ceci, thank you so much. I really appreciate being able to join you today. And Michael, who I've known since he was a mere child, it's lovely to see him. And also something you may not know about Michael, in addition to all that you've heard about him, he is a wonderful father, and you'd have to ask Jen if he's a wonderful husband. I guess he is, but I know he's a great dad. And so, Michael, I'm excited to be able to talk to you today.
Cindy, likewise. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and I'm honored to have this opportunity. I was thinking back of our relationship, 2 young Democrats. I think you and your wonderful husband were courting at the time. And, you know, it's always great to hang out with a fellow Dem in our wonderful South Bay city of San Jose, which I know you and your family make your home. And it's just a privilege to be with you.
Well, I'm excited to be with you too. And one of the reasons, and I know many of the people who are with us today know this, that you are in many respects a pioneer in San Jose, and your development career has really been, you know, pre-RDA, when we had redevelopment agency, now post redevelopment agency, and all the new tools or the lack thereof that it's needed to really do the developments that are difficult and challenging that you've been so willing to take on. So I'm really honored to get a chance to have a conversation with you about this. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, how do you pitch transit-oriented development and, you know, as you're trying to get investors, and how do you pitch San Jose? Because I know you are Mr. San Jose.
Thank you. I like to refer to myself sometimes as Midtown Mike, because during the last Great Recession, it was very challenging to pitch San Jose, Santa Clara County to investors, and to get them to understand the vision of what San Jose is and could be, especially coming out of the financial crisis. And so it was difficult. In fact, I remember being actually on Wall Street in 2007 and watching the Lehman people pack up their bags and leaving, and people were crying in the streets. And I couldn't wait literally to escape New York. But when I was there, the vision of transit-oriented development was evolving. And it, you know, at the time we had purchased the Valley Transportation site there at Sonoma and West San Carlos with Swenson Companies. And I just couldn't get people to understand how an old cannery plant could turn into this, you know, vibrant area of the city. And so we're kind of on our own, because you mentioned redevelopment was at that time starting to go away, and it was difficult. But the perseverance, I think, of the region's economy, and what people really started to understand, that technology would shape not just the job front, but also Wall Street. I think that a lot of real estate commercial developers like myself on the apartment side, you know, started to see that, you know, there was a great story here, and that people need to take transit to get to A to B. So we were fortunate that the timing of this, and like they said, sometimes timing is everything in life, or it's better to be lucky than good. But I think good is preparation, and because of the general plans, specific plans like Midtown, that allowed the investment to be cultivated. So we were fortunate to have that. And so I'll put a question back to you that probably is in the same vein. And you know, you have been part of these. I think you were part of the Midtown specific plan, maybe back on council and some of those great specific plans. But I mean, why should, you know, now moving it forward to today and after all we've learned, you know, as former chair and current board member of the VTA, I mean, why should developers continue to bet on transit-oriented development?
You know, that's an excellent question. I mean, I think one is that I think it's going to be a necessity. I mean, here's what we know. We know that 7 million people a year die from fine particulate matter, and that comes from cars that are fueled by gasoline. So in many respects, it's really about saving the planet and doing it in a way that really sparks the economy. And I think one of the things I think is so exciting about the work that you do, Michael, is that I think you help people see the opportunity. And at VTA, we have 26 sites that are, you know, in multiple jurisdictions. So one thing I would say is that we want those sites to be able to be, in some respects, flexible. And that's something actually I'm learning a lot about relative to the way we put out RFPs and RFQs, because we want to be able to work with the city, the jurisdiction that site's in is critical, and then be able to do something that lifts up the surrounding community, but does it in a way that really will encourage the use of transit. As an example, I think you've made this point to me many times that we know that jobs near transit increase ridership even more than housing near transit does. So that's something that we have to keep our eye on. And that second, we need to look at building communities that are very, very diverse, right? So that you're not just having retail, but you have retail with family housing, retail with, you know, with maybe some business component as well. So we've got to be okay with mixing it up and really working dynamically with developers, the city, and VTA to get the most value we can from these lands.
Couldn't agree with you more. It's important.
Well, I actually think, Michael, that's a lesson that you've been trying to drill into me. So well done. Congratulations. You know, one other thing I'd be really interested in hearing your perspective on this is that when you imagine how we think about infrastructure for this region, what are the core components of infrastructure you think we should be investing in as a region? And how do you think about, has that changed for you pre-COVID to now?
Excellent question. And it's interesting. I think the big infrastructure item that has me concerned is electricity and water. Electricity, because we've kind of gone a little bit extreme, especially in the city of San Jose with the new REACH codes, which I understand the environmental reasons for that. You mentioned carbon greenhouse gas emissions, but the problem with that is it's literally not as easy as just flipping a switch. And I think the building codes and what it requires now to eliminate natural gas, which is a very, you know, cheap type of like, you know, empowerment of any building. For example, water heaters are, you know, most efficiently run with natural gas. Well, with the REACH code, you no longer can use natural gas to power that building. So that one right now concerns me. And then the current state of affairs with the Pacific Gas and Electric. You know, when we have rolling blackouts, when we have wildfires and their infrastructure is old, and then not to mention their service levels can be challenged as well. Now, by the way, I want to applaud the great employees of Pacific Gas and Electric. I have met some incredible hardworking individuals, both on the field, in the lines, and in the administrative office. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say as a developer to say that there's serious issues with Pacific Gas and Electric's infrastructure. And then the idea that we're only now going to use electricity as your sole source of powering a building, I think there's some serious concerns that could happen in an earthquake. I think there's serious issues that, as well as an equity issue on what people can afford. You know, apartments are really our first-time home buyers, our apartment owners. And so they all have meters and they all pay their own electricity. It's not like it's a group electricity rate. They pay the same rates as a single-family home ownership. So what's the effect on their bill in the future? So I would say that my biggest issue right now, and when I look at sites, I'm concerned in San Jose that I think they've jumped into this reach code really fast. We're finding that the building departments are having a hard time interpreting that on electricity standards. And so, look, we have to build infrastructure for electricity, for our cars, for our lifestyles. But let's make sure that we're doing it in a meaningful way where we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater with the cost side, which we know we're always challenged. So I'll kind of pose that question back to you as a key elected official. What do you think? There's a lot of discussion about infrastructure, especially at the federal level. Mm-hmm. How do you think those infrastructure items are going to affect Santa Clara County and Greater California moving forward?
It's interesting, Michael, and I know you and Jen are know a lot about the history of California, and in particular its political history. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about was former Governor Brown, the first Governor Brown. And remember that he had a vision for roads that would connect the whole state. And he really kicked off the development of our higher education system and investing in primary education. And, then he looked and said, well, what can I do to bring the best and the brightest here to California? And what am I going to do to make sure goods and services can be moved from point A to point B? And he had a vision around that. And I think when I think about the future, I think the point you raised, Michael, that's so right on is that redundancy is core to resilience. And so when we think about the future of the state and the future of our region, we have to remember that what attracted businesses here eons ago was steady energy and clean water. And the point you raised about what do we need to do to enhance those, we need to invest in energy, and I think building in redundancies for energy, because I think the primary energy should in fact be electricity, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of investment that needs to be done to make that the case. I think the second thing is we have to have a diversity, right? You still need to have some gas, you're still going to need to have some diesel, you're still going to need, we've got to think about the world in a much more cafeteria style that really does protect the environment. I think it's possible to do both. But I think the other point you raised, which is we've got to be building water treatment plants. Like Anderson Dam, I know Congresswoman Loughran's been playing a leadership role in making sure we're rebuilding it. That's a 10-year project. We have got to be moving it to make sure we're building in these projects. And then the last thing is, if I'm to think about the highways of the future here, one is we need to make sure that all of our freeways and thoroughfares are designed to allow us to have electric cars and lots of other kinds of vehicles, because this is all going to happen in a layered, textured way. But the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about is, the point you raise around building out our water infrastructure. We're going into another drought. And remember that just in this year, we dealt with COVID-19, power shutoffs, heat waves, and smoke, all at the same time. And that didn't count the other natural disasters we know we could be facing, such as an earthquake. So building out resiliency equals redundancy. And I think investing in our community in a really smart way, which could include broadband, which is something I want to talk to you about. Because if you think about it, the highways of the future, it is broadband. It is broadband being integrated into our communities, because now people are going to be looking for clean water, a great environment, a place that they can live, have entertainment, be with great schools, have access to reliable energy, and they've got to be connected more here than anywhere in the world, right? So I'm curious, how does broadband play in as you're thinking about the future of the state of California, and even as you think about where you invest and why you invest?
Great question. And you and I have had this conversation on other wonderful panels by the leadership group about, the shifting patterns of migration, not just where you live, but where you work. And of course, more people now are going to have hybrid schedules. And kudos to you. You've worked hard with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group and the great companies in this region to really mitigate, which could have been an incredible disaster. And I don't think you nor the Board of Supervisors get enough credit. I think you're measured by, hey, what's going to be, when are we going to get back to normal? That's the standard. Well, that's a hard standard to measure. Maybe if we brought it back down a few notches, I think you've been a leader in making sure that Silicon Valley is open and is open for commerce. And I want to applaud you and your fellow board members for making that a central part with the work from home and making sure that the Silicon Valley, didn't just lay off people. I have to be totally honest. I was very concerned at the outset of the pandemic that too much work from home would create a possibility of people being let go if in fact the economy went farther south. What we learned from this, though, from the data, was that actually Silicon Valley took off greater, and so we're have new shift in patterns from both your commute to obviously from work from home. And to your question and point, that the home now is the office and the office is the home. So if you have an apartment complex, a single family home, what have you, where you dwell, you have to have sustainable broadband service and great connection. And literally it could be the difference maker in an apartment community, which is if I move in, the first thing I need to know is who's my provider and how am I going to get connected. And, there's a lot of independent companies running around right now that want to make, that will provide the service, but if the infrastructure is not there, it can be a problem. And that's an equity issue as well, as in our East Side San Jose communities, where I know you've been a champion for many, many years, that making sure that, I always tell people that I want to find more East Side properties to develop because A, everybody needs a place to live, and B, it's an opportunity to bring more services to those communities, which desperately need it, especially those communities that are disenfranchised, where they don't have the schools open right now. So I think next to your point, next to power and to water, I think you've got to put that in the conversation, broadband, and you're right. And so to that end, I've seen this Biden $1.5 trillion. And by the way, I'm a huge proponent of any infrastructure bills. Are you seeing, as a county supervisor with your staff, are you seeing how this can get to the county and the city levels? How is that path going to be connected? Because I think some of us in the private side have a little bit of like, oh, geez, we're going to 28% tax, blah, blah, blah. And not really understanding what the actual benefits will be to people, like you and I that live average lives. How do you see this connecting the dots with this new infrastructure proposal?
Such a great question. I think, Michael, the point you raised too about like how important this is, right? Garbage, water, sewage. This is what you get connected to at your house. That is a really, really good point. And you're right, we need to think about it that way. What's exciting that they're looking at is giving money into states so that we can do the micro trenching and the investments in the infrastructure that we need. And one of the things I think we have to remember is that cells haven't advanced far enough yet to take care of all of our needs. As an example, the county, in partnership with the city of San Jose, spent over $7 million on Chromebooks and hotspots. And what we learned is the hotspots don't work everywhere because you really need that broadband infrastructure built in. And remember too that broadband built right moves at the speed of light. And that really has to be our standard, because the other point you're raising is if you're working from home, you could potentially do your doctor's appointments from home. You could have another person working from home. And interestingly, as people are going back to school with these hybrid models, one of the challenges is, do the schools have enough broadband to have the capacity to do these hybrid models of education? And again, to your really important point that we talked about earlier, if we're building in resiliency, we're building in redundance, which means that we're creating the flexibility in our infrastructure to respond to whatever the needs are of our community as we're facing climate change and inequity and frankly, even not just racial tension, but the economic inequities that we need to knit back together to have a really healthy society. The other thing I'll just say to you, Michael, is that, leaders like you and many others who are here today who invest in our community, we need to listen carefully to you, because what's critical is that we need people to believe, invest, weigh in, and own. right? Because now there are options to work from anywhere, which means that we've got to be even more competitive to keep people loving the place they live and wanting to be here. And that's why this conversation is so not just fun, but really informative for me, and I'm sure for others who are listening.
As we end this great conversation here amongst two amazing people, I wanted to say, let's end on a lighter note. I mean, I know the family. What will you and the family do when you've got your second vaccine and we're in the June 15th in the perfect world where everything's maybe trying to get back to normal? What are you going to do? You and Mike and Brendan, what are you guys going to do? What's your family going to do?
So as funny as it sounds, the thing I've been missing is going to watch a baseball game outside with sunflower seeds and, a big hat and, and doing that with Brendan and Mike. And, I just miss it. I miss it so much. So that's really what we're going to go. Some people are going to go to Disneyland. We're going to go to a baseball game.
Yeah.
Michael, what about you and Jake and Jen?
Well, there was a time when I felt like, oh my goodness, there's another gala to go to. There's another, so I think Jen and I desire to dress up, go to our favorite nonprofit gala for a great cause, and just hang out with people that we haven't seen and get to see you and others and other great elected officials in this county. We'd love to just be able to get back. Jen mentioned that this Saturday. She said, gosh, I wish there was just an event we could go to on Saturday beyond just an outdoor dinner or something like that. So we all yearn for some of the things that maybe we took for granted, or maybe we thought we were tired of, and as it turns out, we weren't.
Well, listen, keep building a great Silicon Valley, Michael. Thank you for letting me hang out with you. And to the leadership group, thank you for all you did to save lives during COVID-19. I really can't thank you enough.
Thank you all. Thank you, Cindy. We'll see you soon.
Hi, I'm Ahmad Thomas, Silicon Valley Leadership Group CEO. It's no secret that the lack of affordable housing has been a significant problem in our region for years, and the scarcity has led to a disproportionate number of people of color experiencing homelessness in the Bay Area. All of these problems, like so many others, have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. But I wanted to take a moment to talk about what one SVLG member company has done to try to build a sustainable solution. Not long ago, Facebook made a $1 billion commitment to affordable housing in the Bay Area. 1/3 of that funding has been dedicated to Santa Clara County through Facebook's partnership with Destination Home. Then, back in December, Facebook designated $150 million to create at least 2,000 affordable homes for families making less than 30% of the area's median income. It's a commitment Facebook anticipates filling in the next 5 years, by 2026. Part of that effort is Facebook making up to $150 million available for low-interest loans to local governments and nonprofits. With that capital, those entities can buy hundreds more units to create permanent housing. It's an innovative model for other businesses in providing low-cost capital to create thousands more housing units across all of California. Facebook's efforts with key organizations or in collaboration with public partners is funding some effective, permanent, supportive housing models and increasing the availability of affordable housing for those most at risk. And here's a video that tells a little bit more about their amazing efforts and who they help.
I grew up in a community just like this.
How are you, brother? Good, how are you?
Working class neighborhood where folks rolled up their sleeves just to be able to provide for their families. The current affordable housing situation is unsustainable here in the Bay Area. We're not producing enough affordable housing for the folks that are most in need in our communities.
I was homeless for a number of years. I never thought it would happen to me. But it happened to me, and it happened to me quick.
It's so important for the families that live around here to be able to find affordable housing. It's the only way that for many of them, they get to keep those family and community and cultural connections that very much shape them.
Here the rent is so expensive. How can I support 6 kids myself?
I grew up in East Palo Alto. The people that live there, the people that are part of that community, I want them to stay there. They need to stay there. That's what makes a community.
The Community Housing Fund is an effort to support those most in need of housing in our local communities. So we've made the decision to invest $150 million to enable developers to build housing for folks that are lowest income and on the verge of homelessness.
There's going to be like 67 units that are going to be here, all brand new construction. I really want to grow with East Palo Alto because it's my home.
It's important to partner with organizations like Destination Home and Eden Housing, along with LISC. One of the things that I valued in terms of the approach is really the inclusion of community voices and how much that should really shape the way that we think about our community investments.
You live over on the other side?
Yeah, I live up on the top floor, but it's around the corner.
Gotcha.
I got to pick the apartment.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, I get the morning sun in. I like the morning sun.
As much as it's a meaningful step for us to think about $150 million being invested in the local community, this is really a part of our larger efforts around a $1 billion fund that we established. The goal is really to build 20,000 units. The Community Housing Fund really speaks to what we do, which is bring community together.
To be able to have a place for my boys, my family, is something that I think some people take for granted.
It's so nice to turn that key in the lock and know that you're home. There's nothing like it.
Now life is a little bit easier. That's all I need.
But engaging with the issue of affordable housing, which has so many complicating factors, means you need to try a variety of approaches. One innovative one, born right here in the Bay Area, is a company Facebook invested in, Factory OS. Believing housing should be built more like cars, Factory OS takes a tech-driven approach to the housing development process. Factory OS has built nearly 1,000 units to date, driving down production costs by 20 to 40% in the most expensive housing market in the country. Factory OS can erect a 100-unit apartment building in less than 10 days, delivering housing over 40% faster than conventional construction can. Facebook's investment in Factory OS is an example of not just supporting efforts to increase multi-family housing, but investing in high-quality, innovative, cost-effective solutions to create it, and ones which create a more robust community in those who live in those homes and for those who produce them. Please take a look.
We have a perfect storm related to housing right now in the country, but particularly in these higher job-rich communities where we've got incredible pressures on population growth and at the same time a huge lack of new supply of housing. And you combine all those things from demographics to that lack of supply, and we just don't have enough places for people to live, and the cost of producing it is extraordinary.
Factory OS is quite simply an off-site
construction facility where we're going to industrialize housing construction by building as much of the house as we can here and bringing it to the site.
The only way to do this and to be able to substantially make a change in the cost of construction is to be able to do it so that we can truly lower the cost of housing and be far more methodical and pragmatic as we build our buildings and put them up.
The experiences have been very exciting in that we've found workers that have no experience at all in the construction industry.
It's really just this incredible, almost side benefit of what we're doing, that we've opened up the workforce to more women.
There's more reasons than one to come work here. It's not just money. You have a family here. You know what your commute is. You know when you can get home to your family. You know that you have security. You know that you will be learning on the job. You know you'll be respected.
Our culture in Northern California has always been to not fight technology or evolution in the industry, but to embrace it, support it, and be a part of it, and organize it as we go. We know that if we stop evolution in the industry, at some point we'd become irrelevant.
Companies like Factory OS are absolutely core to solving the housing affordability issue by, first of all, being intentional about saving money through the construction process and ensuring that there's an intentionality of bringing the cost down for the consumer who will ultimately live there.
Parks must matter for cities to matter. I often reflect on the day before the first COVID shelter-in-place directive. There was just so much uncertainty. To clear my head, I took up running along the river trail. And there was something special that happened the more I kept running. I started noticing familiar faces, all running along the trail at the same time. This happened so often that we started giving each other friendly nods in passing. This moment is what a resilient city is meant to show, that even the pandemic doesn't stop the world from turning, and that moments of connection, even in passing, can be fulfilling. It is not just that parks are acre for acre some of the most efficient uses of land to address multiple community priorities: public health, civic engagements, environmental stewardship, economic development, equity, and more. It is that connection to nature and to each other is a foundational need for our health and our civics. And after we look beyond trains, planes, and buildings, we are also creatures that want to connect with each other and to the place that we call home.
Hi, I'm Robin Hines, Senior Director of State Government Affairs at Microsoft Corporation. At Microsoft, our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And we recognize the foundational roles cities have in supporting the same mission in their communities. Over a year ago, Microsoft was one of the first tech companies to make a large $500 million commitment to expanding access to affordable places to live. Now the pledges made by Microsoft and our peer companies exceeds $5 billion, and these funds are being put to work. We also recognize that housing alone is not enough. In October, Microsoft and Starry announced a partnership to accelerate the availability of broadband to affordable housing projects across the country, starting in Los Angeles. This is in addition to the work our Airband initiative is doing in rural areas in California and across the country. And now it is my proud honor to introduce our keynote speaker, President Pro Tem of the California Senate, Senator Toni Atkins. In 2016, she was elected to represent the 39th District in the state Senate. Among the bills that got passed and signed was SB 2, which created a permanent source of funding for affordable housing, a signature piece of legislation she had worked on for 7 years. In March 2018, Senator Atkins was sworn in as Senate President Pro Tem, becoming the first woman and the first openly LGBTQ person to lead the legislature's upper house.
Throughout her career, Senator Atkins has been a champion for those who need a voice and an advocate for veterans, women, the LGBTQ community, and those just looking to find a place they can afford and that they can call home. Please welcome Senator Toni Atkins.
Thank you for the warm introduction. It's a pleasure to join you to talk about the importance of cities. My city is 500 miles south of where most of you are probably watching this. It's known for its beautiful beaches, amazing weather, and the best burritos in California. We may not agree on that last point, but whether we're talking about San Diego, San Francisco, San Jose, or any number of places in California, I think we can agree that our state boasts some remarkable cities. I have a unique appreciation for all that living in a city can offer because I grew up in a very different world in small, mostly rural Southwest Virginia. Technically, Roanoke, where I spent most of my childhood, is a city, but it is a far cry from a bustling metropolis. Opportunities were limited. Returning home with my bachelor's in political science, I got a job at a dry cleaner, knowing full well that I wanted more. When the Navy assigned my twin sister to San Diego, I was happy to have the chance to later follow her to take care of my nephew. Moving to San Diego opened so many doors for me. I got involved in the No on 64 campaign to fight against a proposition that would have caused those with AIDS to lose their jobs, be kept out of school, and even allowed for their quarantine. I took the first step on my career path with a job running clinic services at a women's health center. I began volunteering on Christine Kehoe's city council campaign and was eventually hired onto her team, jump-starting my own future in public service. None of that would have been possible for me in 1985 small-town Virginia. Cities like San Diego and San Francisco are hubs of commerce and jobs, arts and culture, education and innovation. Despite what some clickbait news headlines may have claimed this year, cities are not on their way out, but they need to be more livable for everyone. I bought my first home in San Diego when I was 31. It was $125,000, an unheard of price today that certainly was not chump change then, but was within reach for me. Today, the dream of having a solid job, I'm not talking a six-figure salary, just a good job, and being able to buy a home a decade after graduating from college is out of reach for far too many people trying to live in California's cities. That needs to change. If cities represent opportunity, then that needs to mean opportunity for everyone, not just people in the C-suite. That is what the Building Opportunities for All Senate housing package would do, and that's why I hope I can count on your support for it. These 6 bills are focused on addressing California's dire need for more housing, especially in cities, targeting different elements of what is an incredibly multifaceted crisis. One of the bills I'm carrying, SB 9, gives more homeowners the option to create up to 4 small-scale developments on their property. Think accessory dwelling units and duplexes. This law has massive potential. It would naturally create more affordable housing for renters, opening up desirable neighborhoods families would have been priced out of otherwise, while also helping homeowners create an additional income stream. And it would give people a way to help an aging parent or family friend find an affordable place to live. Another bill I'm authoring would speed up the time it takes to process and approve housing development projects, shaving off months, if not years. This bill, SB 7, takes the success that now sunset AB 900 had with large-scale projects of $100 million or more and expands it to include smaller projects that start at $15 million. I'm also excited about SB 6 from my friend Senator Caballero, which would make it so that office and retail spaces could be turned into housing and would cut red tape for production at those sites. SB 6 smartly recognizes that shopping, commerce, and working in 2021 does not always need the brick and mortar space it once did, and breathes new life into otherwise underutilized spaces. Now more than ever, our state and cities have to work together to get our economy back on track. Spurring job growth is vital, and so is ensuring that all workers, those with college degrees and those without, those who work for big corporations, mom and pop shops, as teachers, and as custodians, can afford to live in the cities they work in. My colleague Senator Wiener's bill, SB 10, would help bring more housing, including affordable housing, to cities by allowing them to upzone to 10 units in existing urban and job-rich areas that are near transit. If cities zone for denser housing near public transportation, employees would not have to wake up at the crack of dawn to get to work, endure long-hour commutes, and live far from the cities they serve. And employers would have an easier time attracting and retaining top talent. We need to ensure bright minds can afford to live in places like Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, so they can continue working at our cutting-edge companies and contributing to the many innovative solutions coming out of California. Solutions like the remdesivir drug created here in our state by the teams at Gilead, which is helping patients with COVID leave the hospital significantly shorter stays. Advancements like the ones Kaiser and other healthcare providers have made in their telehealth offerings, giving patients the option to access care from the safety of their own homes. And what would we have done this year if not for the folks that brought us Zoom, helping us stay connected while apart? I recently had a call with the mayors of California's 13 biggest cities, including Mayor Liccardo, and we all agree that while the pandemic has changed many things, the important role that cities play is not one of them. The companies that call cities home and the workers and community members that really bring them to life can attest to that. The mayors and I also agree that we all have a part to play in making sure everyone can afford to live and work in California's cities, to access the many opportunities they have to offer. Addressing our housing and our homelessness crisis is a good start. That's why my Senate colleagues and I released the Build Back Boldly budget plan that will include once-in-a-generation transformative actions on housing, along with other key challenges facing California. I look forward to having your support on it as we move through the budget process. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Senator Dave Cortese representing Silicon Valley. Thank you, Pro Tem Atkins, for that overview of the Senate's Building Opportunities for All housing package and for your leadership in putting this package together to speed up housing production and reduce the number of people facing eviction or homelessness in California. Our state is taking unprecedented steps to tackle one of the greatest challenges we face. And this plan sets forth an integrated and impactful approach to meeting the state's housing needs. Thank you again, Senator Atkins.
If you've enjoyed the Cities Matter Summit, share it. Our entire summit will be available for rebroadcast on Monday morning at svlg.org/watch. But now we thank our bronze sponsors, Microsoft and the Santa Clara County Association of Realtors. Thanks to our media sponsors, the San Francisco Chronicle and the Bay Area News Group. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kat Wortham, Director of Health and Housing Policy for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. We want to thank everyone who contributed to today's program, our amazing panelists, our special guests, our sponsors, and of course Zoom, who handled the production infrastructure that brought you this content today. We also want to take a moment to thank some of the elected representatives and government officials who joined us today as part of our program. This includes Supervisor Chavez, Senator Wiener, Executive Director McMillan of the MTC, Teresa Alvarado, Chair of the California Water Commission, Mayor Liccardo, and of course, Secretary Buttigieg. And thank you as well to the many elected and appointed officials in our virtual audience this morning. Finally, a big shout out to our entire housing, land use, and transportation team. To Shannon Diatley-Johnson, our VP of Events, who once again helped deliver an amazing summit. And a very special thank you to our Manager of Digital Content, Kelly Kirkendall, who's leaving SVLG today for a fantastic new job, but produced our amazing new website before she left. You can watch this entire summit rebroadcast there on Monday at svlg.org/watch. Then make sure you subscribe for updates about our COVID Town Hall on April 29th. Reach out to events@svlg.org to receive an invite if you haven't gotten one already. So, from all of us at the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, thank you, and see you next time.